So good afternoon, everybody. First session after lunch. It's always good for an engaged and attentive audience. But it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to share our experience of the Woodlawn MBT with you. For those that don't understand what MBT is, mechanical biological treatment, often or previously referred to by some as AWT, alternative waste treatment. It's effectively the extraction of organics from a municipal solid waste stream to produce an organic compost for land application. Just before I'm going to start, I just wanted to make some observations from an industry perspective about this morning and the China National Sword policy. There are some correlations, I think, in relation to infrastructure generally, whether it's organics, recycling, mechanical biological treatment, or energy from waste. For me, it's all about markets. You don't try and produce a product from waste unless you've got a market for it. And it's around cost. The cost of doing that is inherently more expensive than landfill. Recycling issues, as has been said this morning, need resolution across all levels of government and industry. And for me, it starts at a federal level. What we really need is producer responsibility. Producer responsibility for packaging, producer responsibility for hazardous waste streams. And I think CDS at a local state level is a great starting point, but that's not going to fix the problem that we've got. And then the education piece. There is a huge amount of education that needs to go out there into the general public to better engage and better improve recycling performance. I find the industry and all of us live in a bubble. You talk to people outside of the industry, and they either don't get it, aren't interested, and simply don't care. So, you know, there needs to be a whole piece, and that really starts with, I suppose, local government education programs. Yeah, I mean, just to summarize, the simple fact of the matter is we manufacture, we consume, and then we dispose because it's a cheaper option than recycling. So, for me, policy needs to change things, and then the perceptions of the public will follow. Oh. Sorry, can I go backwards? I expected another slide. I made a presentation 2 years ago at COFS with Nezrock about how we got to this point in developing the MBT. I'm going to share some of those key points with you this afternoon, because they're important in terms of how the industry can develop infrastructure for local government. But to start with, to give you a clear picture of what MBT is, I'm going to share a 5-6 minute video with you, which takes you through the commissioning and the early operation of Woodlawn MBT. So I hope you enjoy this. Okay, so I hope that gives you a flavour of the scale of the project. Some of the key numbers were on the slides. Apologies, some of that text went a bit quickly, but it's almost 100 million Australian in terms of investment. Some of the challenges that we overcome to get to this point, I just want to reiterate, as I did 2 years ago here, long-term commitment for waste supply was critical. And we achieved that back in 2013 with SSROC, the Southern Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, and then subsequently added NESROC into that mix as we were working through the design stage and expanded the facility. So industry needs certainty on waste supply to develop infrastructure. The identification and delivery of local infrastructure, I mean, this isn't local to SSROC, this is down in Woodlawn. But what was critical to the delivery of the contract was a second rail transfer terminal for Sydney, which is located in Banks Meadow in the southern Sydney area. We achieved approvals and delivered that within a 4-year period only because of the support of the SSROC group of councils. The approvals risk, we had the approval back in 2008. It took us this long to build it for 2 reasons. Cost, landfill levy needed to catch up, and long-term waste supply. Councils traditionally have been used to 5-7-year contracts, which just isn't sufficient to fund this sort of infrastructure. Technology, process, and performance risk, we obviously take that on board. We're comfortable with this technology. We operate 30 of these across Europe, have done for almost 30 years. The waste growth risk is a challenge. It's a challenge to build infrastructure for waste that isn't there and not to fill it immediately, to run it efficiently and effectively and deliver a reasonable cost back to councils. And waste composition is obviously a major risk for us over long-term contracts. So the way our contracts are structured, we take that risk unless councils make a change. There's no point implementing a FOGO scheme when you have this as your back-end solution for residual waste. And the economies scale issue I've touched on before. Individual councils are generally too small to develop infrastructure cost effectively. We do build these at 30,000 tonnes across Europe. We build energy from waste plants across Europe at 50,000 tonnes a year, but they are not cost effective when compared to the cost of landfilling. In terms of current performance, as I said, we're a year in. The design criteria was 144,000 tonnes, 55% diversion from landfill. And we have to achieve a site-specific compost exemption in terms of the product before we apply it to land down at Woodlawn. We're at about 78 to 80% of throughput currently. We have proved it at 100% throughput, so we know it can achieve that design objective. We're only at about 40% diversion from landfill currently, so there's a lot of optimization to go. We hope to be up at our design and contract throughput by the 3rd quarter of this year. Compost quality is a challenge and has been a challenge and will be a challenge going forward. We are meeting all of our exemption criteria on things like heavy metals and contamination. But there's something called, and apologize if I don't pronounce this correctly, phthalates, which is a chemical additive that's added to soft plastics and cosmetics. Now, we have a limit on phthalates within our exemption, which is unusual. None of the other MBTs do. It's not in biosolids exemptions. It's not in organic compost exemptions. And we're finding it a challenge to meet that exemption criteria at the moment. And it's a difficult thing because there's currently no mechanism to address that technically at the moment. So that's a conversation we're having with EPA. SRF from residuals, that was always envisaged as part of a second stage to convert the residual into an SRF, or solid recovered fuel, for export. Again, the planning process with New South Wales government, EPA hurdles are delaying the delivery of that element of the project. And given the current global dynamics within the industry, the national soil policy, all of those markets are offshore with a very small number of exceptions. So the risks in going down that path and relying on overseas Southeast Asia markets for fuel are risky. What does the future look like for Veolia in terms of infrastructure? I'm talking Sydney here, and I'll talk to Sydney specifically. I think Sydney has a problem coming, and nobody's really giving it the attention it deserves. Sydney is served by two Class 1 putrescible waste landfills. Both have a finite life. Woodlawn, being one of them, has a life of about 35 years. The other, Lucas Heights, considerably shorter than that. There's about 1.8 million tonnes of putrescible waste in Sydney. The current landfill infrastructure and MBT is just about enough for that, with a little bit of growth, but Sydney's growing at an alarming rate in terms of infill and population increase, and therefore waste generation. So we are coming up against a problem in 3 to 5 years' time. The problem is the development of infrastructure takes a long time. The Woodlawn MBT was 10 years from planning approval, so 5 years in planning approval, 10 years before we developed it. We're going to see that for any new infrastructure solution. Where is Veolia going? We've got existing approvals to expand MBT, to duplicate it and double the size, subject to securing the waste stream from local government for 70% of the input. There are long-term risks in the compost exemption that we need to consider. Other countries have gone down the MBT path and then suddenly changed the rules. The UK is one example, which banned the application to land of compost from MBT facilities. So immediately the industry folded overnight. Cost is an issue. MBT is currently more expensive than landfill, and I said the lead time is the lead time. Energy from waste has been talked about and is being talked about a lot within the industry. I've got a more positive outlook on that as an alternative. It's a proven technology. Veolia operates 60 energy from waste plants across the world. The New South Wales policy puts a constraint on what you can burn, which Veolia support, but it does put a cost upon a cost. Councils have to implement FOGO or put their waste through an MBT before you can put it through an energy from waste plant. We've got to address the myths and the scare stories around energy from waste. It's a smaller carbon footprint than landfill. It's one of the safest technologies out there in terms of its emissions into the environment because it is so heavily regulated. So it's a public and a political education process that I know when I was back in the UK, we went on that journey, and that took 5 to 10 years before we could bring the politicians on board and the public on board. And the Green Party across Europe support energy from waste as a solution for waste management. And then there's the affordability piece. Waste disposal in Sydney is currently in the region of $250 a tonne with levy. Energy from waste competes against that today at a scale of 300,000 tonnes a year. So that's where Veolia is focusing its efforts for the future. Thank you for your time.